Michael, thank you so
Got
much for joining us again. I really appreciate you taking time for this. You have a very unique position to provide comments on the recently published National Cybersecurity Policy. What are your thoughts? It seems like this document was expected for a long time, and what are your first impressions?
I mean, certainly I like it. I think that it's an evolutionary document in the sense that you can understand, when this particular Biden administration came into office, one of the first things they issued was, Executive Order 14028, and they were specifically focused on enhancing cybersecurity across the board. And they took the initial step, which was, if you're an entity and you're going to do business with the federal government, we're going to hold you to a higher standard from a cybersecurity perspective. And here are the things that we're going to do through procurement law that are going to force you to, have a more substantial cybersecurity posture than you would otherwise. Likewise, this administration has had, I believe it's 2 now, meetings with foreign leaders, specifically to focus on combating, cybercrime and ransomware. And so clearly they're serious about it. And I think this is just the next evolution of the steps that they're taking in this specific policy. Now they're talking about, the need to enhance cybersecurity across the board in all facets that touch the lives of American citizens. So I think it's just a natural evolution of getting serious about cybersecurity, and I think in my mind it's a natural evolution of the steps that this administration is taking.
It certainly makes a lot of sense. And the components of the policy, the 5 pillars. The first one talks specifically about critical infrastructure, and as with anything, I guess the attackers are going for the low-hanging fruit, and it's really kind of the weakest link in the chain that usually gets hit. And with so many kind of components of the critical infrastructure, the federal agencies, the local authorities, private sector, there are so many different components. There's supply chain involved kind of across the board. Do you see this policy, do you think it'll be used as a way to harmonize cybersecurity posture and bring everyone to kind of a certain acceptable level where at least it's not an easy target? Do you think that the policy will be kind of used as a tool to drive this harmonization going forward?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. I mean, so clearly they have to put down in the policy the focus on critical infrastructure as kind of the number 1 pillar, but that's not a departure from any of the norms. I mean, that's something that this administration and to be fair, even previous administrations had been focused on. And so they're going to continue to drive efforts to shore up critical infrastructure providers across the American economic landscape. And I think it's just natural that they put that number 1. I don't want to jump ahead too far, but the key for me in this is they talk about the regulatory authority and the legislative authority of the United States government in order to be used to affect change. And that I think is a big departure from where we had been in the past. I think in the past, it was really about trying to get organizations to come together to, on their own accord, adopt cybersecurity policies and measures that would strengthen cybersecurity. But in this particular instance, they make an allusion to the fact that this administration is willing to work with Congress in order to enact legislation that would force commercial entities to a significantly higher bar. Now they also reference using regulatory authorities and working with the commercial entities themselves in order to craft regulations that not only support enhanced cybersecurity, but are themselves things that the commercial entities could do. And they talk, a little bit more about, the financial incentive, which had not probably previously been there to increase cybersecurity. And so they're talking about, leveling the playing field from a financial incentive perspective as well. So I think really interesting for me is that they're using market forces, legislation, regulatory authority, all of those levers that the government can use. They're talking about using those in order to up the bar from a cybersecurity perspective, which I think is that's really a big change in my mind.
Certainly. Well, it's kind of forcing change, not just for one vector, but from all available to them. I guess probably a good way to put it. And going to the next pillar, about disrupting and dismantling threat actors. Specific countries were mentioned: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. So, and it's interesting with this conversation. It's really, from our previous conversation, even though most ads for cybersecurity companies, they picture a teenager in a hoodie, like hunched over a computer, it's really most companies are dealing with often state-sponsored organizations or really kind of enterprise-sized criminal groups. So it's really not kind of a lone wolf type scenario. It's really well-resourced and not very well-intentioned real organizations that we're up against. It's interesting that those particular countries were mentioned, but I think what caught my eye is that an intent to change the designation of some of those actions of threat actors from criminal activity to a threat to national security, which I think opens up the next question: some of the implications could be of designating something as a threat to national security, and what some of the actions could be invoked as a result. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in the past, as you've alluded to, right, we have treated cyber attacks as criminal activities, and there are certain, we all know them, right? There are certain law enforcement investigative entities with the authority under U.S. statute to conduct criminal investigations. If you're now changing the designation from a criminal activity to a threat against national security, it's not too far of a leap for most people to understand that now you're invoking a whole series of new authorities and involving a whole series of new government entities who can now enter into this game, whereas before it was limited to law enforcement entities. So it does bring significantly more resources to bear against the problem set, and I think that and as well. We're not looking to collect evidence in pursuit of a prosecution. If this is a threat against national security, it's changing the dynamic to say that, you know, those entities that have authorities under national security purviews now have an opportunity to go after these entities, these cyber entities, and degrade them as one would degrade any entity who is a threat to national security. And so that opens the aperture much broader, not only from the resources that the United States federal government brings to bear, but, you know, for the capabilities and it changes, I think, some of the tactics, because again, we're not entirely looking to bring a case to court. We're actually really looking just to simply degrade the capabilities, if not eliminate the capabilities. And so that's a significant change in and of itself.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think it also changes the approach from being a little bit more reactive. Well, first the harm needs to be done. Then we need to find out who was involved. Then we need to collect evidence. Then we need to bring them to justice. That process could take weeks, months, years in certain cases. And by then, actually bringing those responsible to justice, well, one, may be problematic, but two, the damage is done, and often it's irreversible by changing the focus, by shifting the focus from designated as a criminal activity versus a threat to national security. That allows the entities that you mentioned to be a lot more proactive and forceful in going after those threats. It certainly makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
The kind of next pillar in the policy talks about different players, both government entities on federal and state and local level, and various private organizations as well. And kind of within that, the policy specifically talks about shifting partially the burden of cybersecurity from end users, which it seems like it's the status quo now. The end users are responsible for their own cybersecurity posture. Obviously, there is cybersecurity insurance and vendors involved in that as well. But the policy specifically talks about software providers and shifting the burden of providing software products with kind of baked cybersecurity baked in, and shifting the burden onto software providers, which to me is, it certainly makes a lot of sense. The question that I have is more around kind of implementation. One, because it's software and cybersecurity. If we talk about them, it's always a moving target. Different upgrades, different patches, different zero-day exploits that are becoming kind of known. Not even talking about kind of the tectonic shifts to the cloud and kind of the mobile revolution and things like this. Just from the technical perspective, I guess the first question, from the technical perspective, how do you see this pillar being implemented, and how would that look like, just from kind of the technical standpoint of shifting this burden to software providers, number one. And number two, in your view, would this not create an incentive to resort to kind of legal action? For example, if the company got breached, instead of kind of looking internally, they may consider saying, look, we did everything we could, but it's really the software vendor who sold us the software is to blame, and therefore that entity needs to kind of bear the burden of the financial burden of that particular breach. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is the part of the policy that has the broadest implications, because as you've alluded to, there's a lot of different levers that they allude to, regulatory authority, legislation, so on and so forth, that could be utilized. But the intent is to push out to the individual entities that make the software the responsibility to ensure that that software is secure from a cybersecurity perspective. And if you think about it, in most of our lives in, you could argue, Western democracies, regulatory entities do ensure that the water we drink is pure, and that the air we breathe is clean, and that the food that we eat is free of pathogens, and that the medicines that we use are legitimate medicines and have been tested, and that the cars we drive pass crash safety tests. And so there's a whole series of regulatory entities that ensure many of the products and services that we use are actually safe to actually use in the way that they were intended. So I don't think it's a far stretch to say, hey, software is such a huge part of our lives now that there needs to be some entity that is ensuring that there are some bare minimums that these software providers actually adhere to in order to ensure us that, there's a minimal level of security within those software products. Now, the devil's in the details. Is that done through regulation? Is that done through legislation? As you've alluded to, does it open the door for liability for corporations that are not able to adhere to certain standards? I think this is the part that is yet to be determined. I'm not clear as to, the first course of action is potentially regulatory, working with regulators, or whether the first course of action is necessarily legislation. So we'll have to see how this one plays out. This one is definitely, as we noted earlier, this is a tectonic shift to force software developers to adhere to cybersecurity and do it up front, as opposed to having to have consumers or entities that are consumers of these products do it at the back end. This is a big shift, and there's lots of levers that the federal government can pull. It just remains to be seen which ones that they're going to pull. But clearly, this is one of the big areas in this policy.
Certainly, and I think, as obviously these pillars and these policies will be elaborated and kind of fleshed out down the line, I envision a future where software companies will approach development differently. Mm-hmm. Meaning, well, one of the approaches is move fast and break things. As we know, was kind of initially in early days was the approach at Facebook. If the government puts those boundary conditions, I think it may just change the perspective and the intent of how those products are developed in the first place, with security baked in from early on rather than spread as a thin layer at the end. Which I think it'll be interesting to see how that it will just change the habits and the perspectives of developers and those various software companies. I think one of the pillars further down the line talks about collaboration between various entities in the federal, state, local government, and corporations and private equity entities, but also allies kind of on the global scene. We see often that some of the bad actors, the hackers, they're apprehended and overseas and then extradited. And I think with the policy, those things will kind of will make news more frequently than now. What kind of developments in that area in terms of further coordination and collaboration with kind of global governments do you see?
I don't see. This is the one area where I don't see big changes occurring. I mean, it's a well-stated goal. It's a noble goal, but you noted this up front. The vast majority of these cyber actors work in countries that are not going to join, the Western defined, order for lawful existence, right? I mean, they're going to hide in countries that give them cover to conduct these operations, as you noted. Specifically in the case of North Korea, this is arguably the biggest source of North Korea's income is cybercrime. And so they're engaged in this from a purely economic activity, which is how do I fund my regime, which is effectively cut off from all trading partners with, you could say the exception of China to a limited extent. And so some of these countries where these cyber criminals operate, we're just never going to get into. And so we could, which I think drove one of the earlier points, which was, we're going to change this from, in part two, we're going to change this from a criminal activity because we know that these criminals operate in hard to get to locations. And since we can't get to them, we're going to do our best to actually destroy their ability to actually conduct cyber operations because the realization is we're not going to get to them from. So I think this pillar, while noble in intent, and certainly the federal, state, and local governments can do more to coordinate activities, no doubt about that. But I think the countries on the global scene that can coordinate activities, they have for the largest part. Certainly more coordination can be done, but I think this is I just think this is a testament to the fact that we know cyber criminals are doing business in countries that are hard to get to. And while we'd love all countries on the planet to work under the auspices of lawful intent, there are some that are just going to be outside that fold.
Makes sense, but sometimes those bad actors decide to take a vacation.
Certainly,
and travel to countries that are do extradite and kind of more friendly than others. Michael, I know we're coming up on time, and again, thank you so much for sharing your perspective today. I guess last question, from the perspective of a corporate CISO, I know you're a big proponent of collaboration between kind of the private sector and the federal entities. In the light of this policy, are there any action items or anything that corporate CISOs should pay attention to or take action on?
Well, again, I think this is going to evolve over time, and my hope is that there are more formalized opportunities for all corporate entities to integrate with their state and local and federal officials. The one thing that I would say, if you're a CISO of an organization and you haven't established a relationship with your local FBI field office, like number one thing to do is get to know the FBI in your region, get to know them when you're not under an emergency situation, establish a rapport with them, and you'll begin to build that relationship. And I think from that will open up other relationships. But you want to be able to afford yourself to understand, what the FBI can offer you from a potentially threat intelligence perspective, what they can offer you from, some type of threat protection. They have different programs that lots of corporate entities can afford themselves. And it's, obviously it's a free service, it's your tax dollar at work. So take advantage of that situation. Beyond that, I think it remains to be seen how this is going to evolve. I would contend, for this to work, there's got to be a strong relationship between the corporate sector and the government itself. And that's why I was pleased to see when they talk about, using the regulatory authority, it's not like regulations are going to be made in a vacuum. I do believe that this administration and through the pillars that are described here, they're going to work with industry to understand from an industry perspective, what is accomplishable in the short term, what may take longer term activity. But I also think, as you highlighted, certain organizations have made it a priority to be top of the game when it comes to cybersecurity. And what they're saying, and I think it's a relevant fact, is, hey, we invest our own financial resources to make secure products. And we want the playing field to be leveled, like make everybody exhibit the same type of behavior that we're exhibiting, so that the level is raised for everybody. And I think that that's noble. And I think somewhere in there, my hope is that we'll see lots of corporate entities engage as we walk through further regulation and legislation to improve the cybersecurity posture of everybody.
Certainly. Well, cybersecurity is a team sport, and the sooner everyone realizes that everyone is playing towards the same goal and are on the same team and start working together towards that goal, I think the safer everyone will be. And
absolutely,
Mike, I really appreciate you taking time for this. This is really very helpful. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure your thoughts will be very well received by members of Affinia. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.